Hello and welcome to our website, and thank you for watching this video, the third video in our Foundations of Freedom series. In this video we will talk about status, rights, and privileges and relate those back to the previous two videos, the first one where we talked about equality, the second one where we talked about freedom and sovereignty. If you want a copy of this presentation, after viewing the course, you can download the PDF version of the slides we're presenting to you in our Liberty University Section 1 or on our forms page as form number 12.021. In this segment, we're going to talk about the following subjects. We'll give you an introduction, talk about socialism, status under the law, de facto governments. We're going to define what rights are. We're going to associate who the creator is with the kind of right that it is. We're going to talk about public rights, private rights. We'll give you some references on private rights if you'd like to look up more information on those. We'll describe the federal war on private rights, how corrupted governments unlawfully convert private rights into public rights, and summary and conclusions. And here is a dedication to this segment. The ideal tyranny is that which is ignorantly self-administered by its victims. The most perfect slaves are, therefore, those which blissfully and unawarely enslave themselves, usually because of their own legal ignorance. Dresden, James. So, let's begin. Introduction. In order to have rights, we must know what they are. If you don't know what your rights are, then you don't have any, and people are going to walk all over you, and especially in court. There are two types of rights, public and private. Who created the right determines the type of right being exercised. Rights described in but not created by the Constitution are private and unalienable. In fact, those rights come from God and are created by God. They're simply recognized by the Constitution but not created by the Constitution. Therefore, God is the owner of those rights because He created those, because He created you. Rights created by the statute, also called privileges, are public and revocable franchises, and they're always created by governments rather than constitutions or God. So these are what we call artificial rights. They're statutorily created and recognized, but they may not exist within the natural sphere. Socialism is government ownership or control of all property. Before you can fight socialism, you have to understand the laws of property, therefore, how private property is lawfully and constitutionally converted to public property, meaning government property, and how to litigate to defend against unlawful conversions from private to public, usually by corrupt public servants who are abusing their authority. We must therefore learn the laws of property. I'm sure you've heard it said, a fool and his property are soon separated. If you don't know the laws of property, you are such a fool, or you will be made into such a fool by greedy and covetous public servants. If you want more information about how socialism works and how to fight it in court, then please see our pamphlet, Socialism, the New American Civil Religion, Form 5.016, on our forms page. A closely related matter to rights is status. All statuses under the civil law are a public office, a public right, and what the courts call publici juris. A civil status is property of the government creator or grantor. They, that is the government, have a right to regulate the use of their property. Examples of status include taxpayer under the tax code, driver under the vehicle code, spouse under the family code, person, citizen, or resident under the civil law, statutory law. Status under civil or franchise law is equivalent to person under contract law. In that sense, if someone puts a contract in front of you that they signed but you didn't, and the contract applies to persons or signators or any number of other different names for the people who signed the contract, then you have to sign the contract or act as though you consent to it in some way before you acquire the status of person under that contract. And government law behaves the same way. Why? Because, as we pointed out in our first video, all are equal. If you cannot impose duties on your neighbor, then you can't write an obligation on a piece of paper that obligates him to do anything until he consents. And only after he signs the paper does he become liable for that which you wanted him to do under that publication or contract. The government does the same thing. Only what they do is they publish their proposed contracts in what's called the Federal Register to give notice to you that of the conduct that makes you basically a consenting party to the contract or franchise. All franchises are contracts between the government grantor and the applicant. And by franchises, we really mean government franchises in this case. Status. As a rule, franchises, and here's what the Amjur Legal Encyclopedia says on that subject of franchises. As a rule, franchises spring from contracts between the sovereign power and private citizens, made upon valuable considerations for the purposes of individual advantage as well as public benefit. And thus, a franchise partakes of a double nature and character. So far as it affects or concerns the public, it is publici juris and is subject to governmental control. The legislature may prescribe the manner of granting it, to whom it may be granted, the conditions and terms under which it may be held, and the duty of the grantee to the public in exercising it, and may also provide for its forfeiture upon the failure of a grantee to perform that duty. But when granted, it becomes the property of the grantee and is a private right subject only to the governmental control growing out of its other nature as publici juris. An example would be a driver's license. A driver's license is property of the government grantor. When you go in and apply for a license, you're really asking to receive that property, and you're asking for temporary custody of the property. And while that property is in your possession, you have what they call here the duties associated with possessing it, meaning you have to drive the car in a certain way. You have to obey the vehicle code. You're not allowed to speed. You're not allowed to ram other people or run people over, and so on. Those are the duties associated with the temporary use and custody of the license itself, which is property of the state that is loaned to you. And it can be basically suspended or revoked, in which case it has to be returned to the grantor of the franchise. In which case the privileges associated with using it can no longer be exercised. You cannot invoke or use a, quote, status, unquote, under the civil or franchise law or pursue a, quote, benefit, unquote, associated with the status without being subject to the civil law or franchise that created that status. And we used the driver's license earlier, but there are lots of other types of property the state can loan you. For instance, passports, professional licenses, vehicle license plates, and so on. Pursuing the acquisition of a specific civil status by filling out a government application is the method of effectively consenting to the civil law or franchise that created the status. As we said earlier, if you go into the DMV and you apply for a license, meaning you ask for temporary custody of the state's property, which is the physical card that the license represents, then you indirectly are asking or consenting to all the obligations that are associated with the use of that property. And here is what we mean by that. Maxims of law and biblical proverbs which implement this concept. The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the government lender. Proverbs 22:7. And here's some maxims of law from Bouvier's Maxims of Law. He who receives the benefit should also bear the disadvantage, and he who derives the benefit from a thing, meaning property, ought to feel the disadvantages attending it. So, and the implication is that if you accept that property, whatever it is, and you use it in the way that it is intended to be used, then you accept the obligations that go with that loan of property. Now, let's take a license, for instance. If you ask for a driver's license, you apply for one so you can receive temporary custody and become basically a custodian over government property, then you accept the obligations of the vehicle code. You're presumed to accept the obligations of the vehicle code. However, there's a caveat. Even if you're in possession of that card, that thing, you may operate in a way that doesn't use that thing. For instance, a person who has a driver license is only allowed to use that license when they're using the public roadways for hire. If a person instead is simply having fun or doing their private activities, and they're not basically acting as a taxi driver on the roadways or hauling freight for hire for somebody else, then technically they're not using the public roadways for a commercial gain, and therefore they're not subject to regulation. And because they're not subject to regulation, they cannot use the license or the license number in connection with that activity, which means they cannot really, technically, they should take the license plate off the car, and they should not use the driver license, and they should put not for hire, meaning off duty. The same thing would happen with, for instance, a police officer. A police officer may have a badge and he may have a gun, but he isn't allowed to use either. And he isn't allowed to exercise the authority of an officer unless he's on duty. And whether he's on duty is determined by his choice and his consent. Nobody can force him to be on duty, and he could quit, and he could turn in his badge. Just like you could decide not to be a driver anymore, and you could turn in the driver's license, or you could decide that you're not using the public roadways for hire, and perhaps you may have acquired a license plate or a driver's license, but you don't use them at all, and do not travel as a driver or using a motor vehicle, or because that's what a driver is. A driver is someone who is using the public roadways for hire. And that's what a motor vehicle is too. It's somebody who's commercially using the public roadways for hire. And most people who have and who use licenses technically are not allowed to use those licenses for the purposes that they're using them. However, that usually unnecessarily grants jurisdiction where the government technically doesn't have any. And most people are not smart enough to recognize those distinctions. Moving on. Government theft by status abuse. All franchises are implemented as a subset of the civil law and have domicile on the territory of the government grantor as a prerequisite. A de facto government is one that imputes a status to you that you do not have or do not consent to as a way to steal from you. For instance, they presume that you're a taxpayer even though you aren't, or they presume that you're a citizen even though you don't consent to be one and would rather be a transient foreigner or a non-resident. A de facto government also waives the domicile prerequisite to participation either by not putting it in the law or by waiving it as a matter of policy. In that sense, they act exclusively by private contract, because you have to have domicile as a prerequisite to all the civil law they enforce, or they're not a government. And they're just simply no different than a McDonald's franchise or Walmart franchise, because those franchises also operate entirely and exclusively by contract because they don't own the land that people are on, other than their own facilities. A de facto government is one that is a corporation and not a body politic, all of whose citizens and residents are in fact public officers within the de facto government and franchises. We talked earlier about the driver's license. Technically, it is a crime to use public property for a private purpose or private benefit. And therefore, if the government hands you a license and gives you custody of it, then you better be a public officer before you applied for it and before you received it. They cannot use the property to create any new public offices. They can only issue the property to those who are already officers. So, and once again, they can only regulate public conduct of public officers while they're on duty. So technically, what they're doing is they're using public property to unlawfully create offices, and they're calling those offices public officers, and they're making what used to be private citizens and residents into public officers so they can reach them and steal from them and enslave them. Moving on, a de facto government is one that imputes or presumes a status that you do not or cannot consent to. This violates due process of law. As we said, for instance, they assume that you're a public officer if you have their property in your pocket, Caesar's property, like the license or the Social Security card or the passport or the professional license, and on and on. All presumption that is not proven with evidence or is not required to be proven with evidence essentially is a violation of due process of law and a theft. We talk about that in our pamphlet called Presumption, the Chief Weapon for Unlawfully Enlarging Federal Jurisdiction. Form 05.017. And finally, a de facto government is one that interferes with your efforts to challenge their unconstitutional presumptions about your status. For instance, they presume you're a taxpayer, but they won't allow you to prove that you're not. And they won't accept the burden of proving that you consented to be one. Hence, they're stealing from you. Everything that they do has to originate from your consent in a civil sphere. Not a criminal situation necessarily, but in a civil context, they must always procure your consent, and they must always trace every effort to enforce the civil law back to some form of consent. That is what a de jure government is one that always acts by the consent of the governed, as the Declaration of Independence requires. De facto, here's the definition, the legal definition. In fact, indeed, actually. This phrase is used to characterize an officer, a government, a past action, or a state of affairs which must be accepted for all practical purposes, but is illegal or illegitimate. Thus, an office, a position or status, notice that phrase, status, existing under a claim or color of right, such as de facto corporation. Okay? For instance, United States government is a corporation. All governments are corporations. And if it's only a corporation, and if it never acts as a government because it never honors or respects the domicile prerequisite, then essentially it devolves to simply a private corporation, just like Walmart or McDonald's, that moves entirely by private contract, in which case they cannot assert sovereign immunity because they're not a government. Only governments can assert sovereign immunity, and that sovereign immunity can only be exercised when they're acting like a government. In this sense, it is the contrary of de jure, which means rightful, legitimate, just, or constitutional. Thus, an officer, king, or government de facto is one who is in actual possession of the office. Notice they use that word office. What they really mean is public office, or supreme power, but by usurpation or without lawful title. And usurpation really means proceeding without consent, stealing. That's what it is. While an officer, king, or governor de jure is one who has just claim and rightful title to the office or power. And it's rightful because it was procured with consent in the civil context, but has never had plenary possession of it or is not in actual possession. A wife de facto is one whose marriage is voidable by decree, as distinguished from a wife de jure or lawful wife, but the term is also frequently used independently of any distinction from de jure. Thus, a blockade de facto is a blockade which is actually maintained, as distinguished from a mere paper blockade. Black's Law Dictionary, 6th edition, page 416. Notice the following phrases within the definition of de facto. Quote, such as a de facto corporation, unquote. That's what we have, folks. Our government, our so-called government, is really just a private corporation that ignores the domicile prerequisite and moves entirely by private law and contract, and presumes that everybody's a public officer called a citizen, resident, or inhabitant. And notice it says a position or status. That status is your status as a public officer franchisee in the de facto government, which office was illegally created and maintained. And that illegal status that you have is called person in the Internal Revenue Code, and it's defined in section 6671B and 7343 as an officer or a partnership or employee, meaning statutory employee, meaning public officer of the national government. Okay, and by partnership they mean somebody who has a contract with that government. So you either have to have a contract with them or you have to be exercising an office in order to be a person. And most people aren't doing either. Only by false or fraudulent presumption are they associated with that status of person. And that is a violation of due process, as we pointed out earlier, and it's also theft. Theft by presumption. Rights. So let's move on to rights. What is a right? And this is Black's Law Dictionary again. As a noun and taken in an abstract sense means justice, ethical correctness, or consonance with the rules of law or the principles of morals. In this signification, it answers to one meaning of the Latin jus and serves to indicate in the abstract, considered as the foundation of all rights, the complex of underlying moral principles which impart the character of justice to all positive law or give it ethical content. And by the way, justice, that term justice there, refers to your right to be left alone. So when they say the character of justice, in other words, it protects your right to be left alone. And your right to be left alone starts with your right to exclude everyone else, including all governments and all public servants, from using or benefiting from the use of your private property, starting with yourself and your body and your labor. As a noun and taken in a concrete sense, a power, privilege, faculty, or demand, notice they use the word privilege, that's a franchise term, inherent in one person and incident upon another. When they say incident upon another, that's where the right to control other people who are using that property comes from, that we talked about earlier in the definition of property. Rights are defined generally as powers of free action, and the primal rights pertaining to men are enjoyed by human beings purely as such, being grounded in personality and existing antecedentally to the recognition by positive law. But leaving the abstract moral sphere and giving the term a juristic content, a right is well defined as a capacity residing in one man of controlling, with the assent and assistance of the state, the actions of others. As an adjective, the term right means just, morally correct, consonant with ethical principles or rules of positive law. It is the opposite of wrong, unjust, or illegal. A power, privilege, or immunity granted under a constitution, statutes, or decisional laws, or claimed as a result of long usage. In a narrower signification, an interest or title in an object of property. A just and legal claim to hold, use, or enjoy it, or to convey or donate it as he may please. A legally enforceable claim of one person against another, that the other shall do a given act or shall not do a given act. Restatement of the law of property. That which one person ought to have or receive from another, it being withheld from him or not in his possession. In this sense, right has the force of possession. And that possession they're talking about is just like property. Because rights are property. Rights are simply one of many different types of property. In this sense, a right has the force of a claim and is properly expressed by the Latin jus. Okay, so the important thing is that by possessing a right, you have there's a corresponding duty on the part of some other person with the assistance of the state, to enforce that duty upon that other person. And that's where rights to property come in, as we talked about earlier. If somebody hands you a license, a driver license, and that license is state property before they give it to you, and it continues to be state property after they give it to you, and they simply loan it to you, then as long as you possess that property, they have a claim to your obedience and allegiance and to basically the traffic code that regulates the use of that property, being the driver license. Moving on. The creator of a right is the owner. The creator of a right is always the owner of the right. And here's an example from one court in 1896. We are of the opinion that a statute of a state granting the powers and privileges, notice that word privilege, that means franchise, to corporations are a type of franchise, must, in the absence of plain indications to the contrary, be held to apply only to corporations created by the state over which it has the power of visitation and control. Notice that phrase, created by the state. Corporations created by the state. They can only control what they create. They didn't create you, and that's why they can't control you, and that's why they can't regulate private rights. And that's why they also have to fool you into volunteering for an office in the government before they can regulate your conduct, because you have to become public before they can regulate you. They have to do it through the device of an office. They have to create an office. They have to fool you into volunteering for the office, such as driver or spouse or taxpayer. And once you volunteer, then they enforce the obligations of the office upon you, because you're surety for the office after you volunteer. And the Bible says you're not allowed to become surety, so you should never volunteer. Moving on, it says the legislature in such cases is dealing with its own creations. There goes that word again. Whose rights and obligations it may limit, define, and control. To the same effect are Catlin versus Trustees, blah, blah, blah. So basically, whoever creates the right owns the right. And anybody that possesses that property, because all rights are property, is the servant of the lender of the right. And the lender is the person who created it. So for instance, God created the earth. He owns the earth. As a matter of fact, the Bible says the heaven and the earth are the Lord's. Okay, so if God owns the earth and the heavens, then he owns everybody on it. And we're just temporary trustees over that property. And while we're here, we have to operate under the trust indenture that manages that property, which is the Bible. The government does the same thing. They create a constitution, or actually the people get together and create a constitution, and the constitution creates a government. So because the people created the constitution, and the constitution created the government, then the government works for the people, because they're exercising rights granted or created by the people. Likewise, after the government is created, in the exercise of those delegated authorities, it can create things like other franchises, like corporations, like offices, like franchises. And when they create corporations, offices, or franchises, they have the right to control the people that exercise them. Because, as we said, they can only govern that which they create, and they didn't create you. Moving on, any right appearing in a government enactment is presumed to be created by the government grantor. Hence, they own the right and all those who benefit from or exercise the right. The presumption of government ownership is rebuttable if the source of the right can be traced to the Constitution itself. Notice one other thing, and that is the Constitution itself does not create any rights. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, do not create rights. They recognize rights. Those rights that are recognized by the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, but not created by the Constitution, those rights are actually created by God, and those rights are recognized in the 10 Commandments and the organic law that forms basically the foundation of a society. The organic law being the religious or moral laws or natural laws of that society. So because the rights are not created by the Constitution, then exercising those rights does not create an obligation to anyone. Whereas when the government creates a right or a privilege through a franchise, such as, the vehicle code franchise and their driver's licenses, those are different because they actually created those rights. So once again, the creator of the right is the one who owns the right and controls all who exercise the right. Very important. The creator of the right is the owner. The creator of the right is the owner. Ownership of the public right or privilege created by the civil statute implies the right to control all who exercise it. This is evident from the definition of property, keeping in mind that rights are property. Here's that definition again of a right. A right is well defined as a capacity residing in one man of controlling, with the assent and assistance of the state, the actions of others. And those others are the people in temporary possession of the property that was loaned to them. And that property could be a right. It could be a privilege. It could be an office under a franchise. And that's reinforced again down here. A legally enforceable claim of one person against another. Okay? And that claim arises from possession of the property of the lender by the borrower. Public rights. So let's move on and talk about the two types of rights. Public rights are the first one. Public rights means rights which may be exercised exclusively by an officer or agency of the government. It cannot be exercised by a private human being such as you or I unless they're exercising the office that owns the right or controls the right. They are legislatively created or granted by the government and revocable at any time at the whim of the legislature, and they're usually granted through a franchise, such as the vehicle code or the family code or the tax code. They attach to a status under a franchise agreement or the civil laws that implement it. Examples: statutory taxpayer per 26 U.S.C. 7701A14. That's a franchise status. A statutory U.S. citizen per 8 U.S.C. 1401. Or spouse under the state family code, which is a franchise you consent to by applying for a marriage license. Public rights are protected by statutory law and not the common law. You cannot invoke the common law in a franchise court or as a franchisee. For instance, you can't go into a traffic court, which is not really a court, it's an administrative agency in the executive and not judicial branch. You can't go into that executive or administrative agency that's not a real court and beat your chest and invoke the common law because it doesn't apply. If you want the protections of the common law, you cannot apply for or exercise any status under any franchise. And whatever statuses you do have, you got to get rid of. And as long as you have that status, you will continue to be unequal and inferior and subservient to the administrator of that franchise in the franchise court, which we call a binding arbitration board. You are subservient to basically the administrative commissioner in the traffic court as long as you have an active license that you didn't cancel, because that license is a loan of government property that enforces a franchise, just like all franchises. And public rights are litigated usually in franchise courts rather than in common law courts. For instance, you don't vindicate a violation of the traffic code in a civil court. You go to a traffic court. A civil court judge is typically a constitutional judge who can hear matters of constitutional rights, but a traffic court judge will just think you're a nutso if you talk about rights and you have a driver license while you're there. On the other hand, if you get called into a traffic court for driving without a license and you never had a license, now there's a problem, and that judge can't even hear the case, and it has to be transferred to a real court because you're not a party to the franchise contract, and therefore he cannot supervise your activities because you're no longer in the executive branch as a public officer if you're not a franchisee called a driver. Keep that in mind. Synonyms for public rights: public office, trade or business, as defined in 26 U.S.C. 701A26 as the functions of a public office for the purposes of the income taxation. Publici juris, as we saw earlier in the definitions. Privilege, excise taxable privilege, congressionally created right, license, Social Security number or taxpayer identification number, which are both a de facto license to represent a public office in the de facto government. So the number itself, when you put it on a government form, is invoking the privileges and rights of an office called taxpayer. You don't have to be a taxpayer if you don't want to, but if you're dumb enough to be one, then you better use that number. Nobody can force you to use that number, especially if you're a private human being. Private rights, on the other hand, private rights mean natural rights possessed by human beings, trusts, or entities acting as other than public officers or franchisees within the government, and they're granted by God and are irrevocable and unalienable. By granted, we mean created. Since God created them, then He is the owner of those rights, and He lends them to us while we're temporarily here, and we become His public officers while we're in possession of that property and those rights that He created and gave to us. Private rights are recognized but not created by the Constitution. They are not connected with or shared with the organization or administration of the government, and they attach to land protected by the Constitution of the United States. Okay, so that makes them very different from public rights. Do you remember what we said about what public rights attach to? Public rights always attach to a status. Okay? Private rights always attach to land that you're standing on. Completely different thing. Okay, you cannot exercise a public right without having the status that has that right. For instance, you cannot exercise, an authority or a remedy provided under the Internal Revenue Code without being a taxpayer. And you're not required to be a taxpayer. Technically, you aren't allowed to be a taxpayer if you're a private human being that's not in the government already. Okay, likewise, private rights attached to land protected by the Constitution of the United States of America. So as long as you're standing on land that's protected by the Constitution, then those rights apply to you, and the only way that they wouldn't apply is if you consented to become a franchisee, and then you divorced yourself from the protections of the Constitution, and now consent essentially to be regulated by the content of the franchise agreement itself, which could be the vehicle code or the family code or whatever. And private rights are protected by the common law and not statutory law. You cannot go into, for instance, if you get pulled over for driving without a license, and you are not a public officer, so you can't get a license, and you're not domiciled on federal territory, so you're not eligible for a license anyway, and they take you into traffic court, which is the wrong court because it's a franchise court, and you say, no, I don't enter any plea, Mr. Judge, because I cannot enter a plea without impersonating a public officer called a driver. And if you think I should have a license, then this case has to be transferred to a real court because I demand a jury trial. And by the way, Your Honor, where's my jury box? Because the state constitution says the right of trial by jury is inviolable to all, and there's no jury box in here. So this obviously isn't a constitutional court, and I didn't consent to hear anything that affects my rights in anything other than a constitutional court. I never consented to become unequal. So you're going to have to transfer this downtown to the real civil court, constitutional court, with a real constitutional judge. And if you don't, you're committing a crime. And you're conspiring with me to commit a crime of impersonating a public officer called a driver. Now, are you going to do it or not, Your Honor? Moving on. Why statutory civil law is law for government and not private persons, Form 5.037 proves that statutory civil law doesn't apply to private human beings. It only applies to public officers in the government, and you have to volunteer to become a public officer, whether that public officer is called a citizen or a resident or an inhabitant or a driver or a spouse or a taxpayer or any number of other things. you have to become one of those things because, as we said, franchise rights, meaning public rights, attach to what? They attach to your status, not to the land. Common law and natural law attach to the land. Public rights and franchises attach to a status, always. Private rights defined. Private rights are not subject to legislative or statutory or administrative control by the government unless their exercise injures the equal rights of other parties. And the only remedy that can be provided for such an injury is the criminal law, and that remedy comes after the injury, not before. The criminal law cannot act in a preventive way. It can only act in a corrective way after the injury. And there has to be a real flesh and blood other person who's been injured. And by person we mean a constitutional person, not a statutory person. Remember, all civil law is for public officers in the government, and therefore a person under the civil law is always a public officer, whereas a person under the Constitution is always a flesh and blood human being and not a public officer. Totally different context. Private rights are litigated usually in common law courts and not franchise courts. And if a party mistakenly comes before a franchise court to protect a private right, the only thing the court can do is dismiss the case. Any other approach represents a tort because, as we said before, franchise courts cannot hear matters pertaining to people who are not franchisees. You can't go into traffic court if you're not a driver. You can't go into a tax court if you're not a taxpayer. You can't go into family court if you're not a spouse because you never got a license, and so on. References on private rights. All private rights, most of the private rights are enumerated in the following document on our site. Enumeration of Unalienable Rights, Form 10.002. If you'd like to have a reference, an easy reference that provides case law that documents your natural and unalienable private rights, then you can refer to that document. Private rights are also exhaustively described in Know Your Rights and Citizenship Status, Form 10.009. So we relate the various citizenship statuses to whether you're public or private, and we show you how those get connected. And we provide a background on private rights in our Sovereignty and Freedom page, Section 4. Actually, it's not ours, it's the Family Guardian site. But it's a link on our site. Now that we've discussed private rights and public rights and compared the two, it's useful to hear what Judge Napolitano has to say on the same subject. And the video we're about to show you is entitled The Difference Between Entitlements and Rights. And what he calls a good is what we call a public right. What he calls rights, we call a private right. But the concepts are the same. Let's listen.
Does the government work for us or do we work for the government? How long can the United States of America remain free when the Congress continues to bribe the public with the public's own money? Tonight, entitlements and the government. When Alexis de Tocqueville was making his long trek across America in the early part of the 19th century, a trip that would result in one of the most widely read books in our history called Democracy in America, he made many pithy and true observations about the relationship of the people to the government here. The most relevant for tonight's purposes addressed entitlements, the subject of our work this week here on Fox Business. He said that the American Republic can only endure if the Congress can refrain from bribing the public with the public's money. How right he was, though of course he could not have anticipated the magnitude of the problem, and it is huge. In 2010, the federal government gave away more cash in entitlements than it collected in taxes. It received $2.2 trillion in revenues, and it distributed through various wealth transfers more than $2.3 trillion. We cannot endure much longer at this rate. In the harsh public discourse over the costs of federally managed health care, of Medicare, of Medicaid, of Social Security, and all the other programs by which the federal government gives away cash and gets people accustomed to receiving it. The big government progressives in both parties have been trying to trick us. These folks who really want the government to care for us from cradle to grave have been promoting the idea that health care and entitlements just like it is a right. In promoting that false premise, they have succeeded in moving the debate from whether the feds should micromanage health care, pay for Medicare, compel the states to pay for Medicaid, and fund Social Security, to how the feds should do so. This is a false premise, and we should reject it. Payments from the government do not constitute rights. They are goods, like food, shelter, and clothing. All right, what is a right? A right is a gift from God that extends from our humanity. Thinkers from St. Thomas Aquinas to Thomas Jefferson, from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Pope John Paul II, have all argued that our rights are a natural part of our humanity. We own our own bodies, thus we own the gifts that emanate from our bodies. So our right to life, our right to develop our personalities, a right to think as we wish, to say what we think, to publish what we say, a right to worship or not to worship, our right to travel, our right to defend ourselves, our right to use our own property as we see fit, our right to due process, which is fairness from the government, and our right to be left alone are all inalienable gifts with which we were endowed by our Creator. The government doesn't give them to us, and the government doesn't pay for them, and the government can't take them away unless a neutral jury finds that we have violated someone else's rights. Okay, what is a good? A good is something we want or need. In a sense, it is the opposite of a right. We have our rights from birth, but we need our parents when we are children and ourselves as adults to purchase the goods we require for existence. So food is a good, shelter is a good, clothing is a good, education is a good, and access to health care. Does the government give us goods? Well, sometimes it takes money from some of us and gives that money to others. You can call that taxation, you can call it theft, but you cannot call it a right. A right stems from our humanity. A good is something you acquire or someone else acquires for you. Now, when you look at entitlements for what they are, when you look at the United States Constitution, when you look at the history of human freedom, when you accept the American value of the primacy of the individual over the force of the government, it becomes apparent that those who claim that they have a right to entitlements from the government simply want a permanent form of government welfare and then claimed that they are owed this. Now, when I make an argument like this to my big government friends, they come back at me with this. Well, if the government doesn't provide health care for Junior who is poor, or even for Grandma who is rich, they'll just go to hospitals and we'll end up paying for them anyway. Well, why should that be? We don't let people steal food from a supermarket or an apartment from a landlord or clothing from a local shop. Why do we let them get health care from a hospital without paying for it? Well, my big government friends argue that's charity and the government should be charitable. I say they're wrong again. It is impossible to be charitable with someone else's money. Charity comes from your heart, not from the government spending your money. When we pay our taxes to the government and it gives that money away, that's not charity, that's welfare. When the government takes more from us than it needs to secure our freedoms, so it can have money to give away to secure votes, to perpetuate its own power, that's not charity, that's theft. And when the government forces hospitals and physicians to provide free health care to those who can't or won't pay for it themselves, that's not charity, that's slavery. That's why we have constitutional chaos now, because the government steals and enslaves, and we outlawed that a long time ago. Jefferson, the father of small government, and Hamilton, the father of big central government, rarely agreed on anything in public, but they did agree on this. If the public treasury becomes a public trough, the people will send to Congress those who will promise to steal the most for them. Speech is free, and you have a right to say whatever you want in public, but you don't have a right to a printing press or a laptop. Those goods you need to go out and buy for yourself, and then you have a right to use them. The government may pay for goods. Only God creates rights.
The ability to regulate or tax the use of private property is repugnant to the Constitution. Here's what the Supreme Court said on this subject. A body politic, as aptly defined in the preamble of the Constitution of Massachusetts, is a social compact. There's that social contract thing again, or social compact, and all compacts are contracts, aren't they? And all contracts require your consent, by which the whole people covenants with each citizen, and each citizen with the whole people. And by whole people, they can't mean everybody, because not everybody's a party to the compact, can they? So what they really mean is the rest of the people who consented to the compact, meaning the existing citizens and residents. Those who are not citizens or residents because they're transient foreigners or non-residents are not within the definition of, quote, whole people, unquote. Moving on, that all shall be governed by certain laws for the common good. This does not confer power upon the whole people to control rights which are purely and exclusively private. In other words, the people who are part of the club called government, who joined the club by identifying themselves as citizens and residents on government forms, those people are what they're referring to here as whole people, and that group of people cannot impose duties upon private property, because private property is anything not connected to people who are citizens or residents, meaning not the property of non-residents, for instance. So they cannot regulate. It's just like if you and your neighbor get together and you decide to form a group, and both of you go to a third neighbor's house and knock on his door and said, we've decided that, we formed a club, and we've decided that we own your house. And obviously that would be a theft, now wouldn't it? That third person has to join the group and agree with everybody else before the property becomes owned by the group. Otherwise it's just stealing. Because why? Because you can't have an authority that you can't delegate an authority you didn't have. You and your neighbor cannot get together and create a group called government and steal from other people that didn't consent. If you can't steal from your neighbor, then you and your neighbor can't get together and delegate an authority to a group that they want to call government to steal from a third person. Same thing, and that's why the Supreme Court said this here. But it does authorize the establishment of laws requiring each citizen. Notice they use the word citizen, which is a member of the club. Not everyone, but only those who consent to call themselves citizens. And by the way, the act of becoming a citizen is the most voluntary of acts, according to the Supreme Court. To so conduct himself and so use his own property is not necessarily to injure another. This is the very essence of government, and has found expression in the maxim sic utere tuo ut alienum non latus. From this source come the police powers which, as was said by Mr. Chief Justice Taney in the license cases, are nothing more or less than the powers of government inherent in every sovereignty, that is to say, the power to govern men and things. But once again, they can only govern people who are members. If you don't join the club, you don't own the club. You don't owe the club dues called taxes. You don't owe them allegiance or obedience under the civil laws, at least. And you do, while you're on their territory, you do have to obey their criminal laws, but that's about it. Okay, so as long as you don't shoot anybody or stick up someplace or steal something and commit a crime, then they can't do anything to you if you're not a member of their club. Pretty simple. And logical, for that matter. Rules for lawfully converting private property into public property. All property starts out as exclusively private and beyond the civil control of the government. It is very important to understand the simple rules the government must abide by in converting your private property to public property. Because, as we said, they can only regulate it if it's public. So how does it become public if it starts out as private? Any attempt by government to do any of the following in respect to one's private rights and or private property is theft and a taking of property in violation of the Fifth Amendment if the rules we will show you have been violated. They assert a right to regulate the use of private property. They assert a right to convert the character of the property from private to public, or they assert a right to tax said property. Why? Because what does a tax do? A tax converts private property into public property, which is a theft, isn't it? It's called conversion. It's a violation of 18 U.S.C. 654. It's converting private to public without the consent of the owner. It's just a polite way of saying they're stealing. There's no difference between that and holding a gun in your back. And as we said, all are equal. So a government can have no more authority to take money from you than your neighbor has. Unless you contracted with your neighbor for him to, protect your house and your property, then you don't owe your neighbor anything, and so you can't owe the government either. And they've got to give you a choice about what services that you pay for and which ones you don't. They can't just, steal whatever they want or as much as they want. Supreme Court rules for lawfully converting private property into public property. Extremely important. Okay, look at these rules. They're very simple. Budd versus People of State of New York, 1892. Men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And remember, we said pursuit of happiness means the right to own property. And to secure, not grant or create these rights, governments are instituted. Okay, notice that phrase there, not grant or create. They're recognizing the importance of who created the right is the owner of the right. And they're saying governments didn't create these rights. Okay, so they must be talking about natural rights or God-given rights, recognized in the Declaration of Independence, because if they were talking about franchises, they create all those rights, and so they own all those rights. So they're not talking about those here. So these are natural rights they're talking about here, under natural law. That property which a man has honestly acquired, he retains full control of, subject to these limitations. And there are only 3 limitations. Remember these. Number 1, first, that he shall not use it, that is the property, to his neighbor's injury. And that does not mean that he must use it for his neighbor's benefit, e.g. Social Security, Medicare, and every other benefit. So in other words, you can't hurt anybody with it, but you're not required to benefit them with it. Why? Because it's not your property unless you control it, and you don't control it unless you can deny other people of the benefit of it, right? So they can't force you to benefit somebody else, or you don't own it. That's the whole point of having property to begin with. And number 2, second, that if he devotes it to a public use, he gives the public the right to control that use. And by donating it to public use, an example would be associating formerly private property with a public identifying number, such as a Social Security number. If you associate public property with private property, you cannot use public property for a private benefit, and therefore a conversion has to occur of one of the 2 pieces of property. Either the number has to convert to private property, or the private property has to transmute some portion of it to public property, because it can't be both. It can't be Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's one or the other. And so associating with a government number is what they would say, if they were honest and sincere, is one of the methods for donating formerly private property to a public use, because it creates a public interest. Because that number attaches public rights and an office, because you can't use that number, which is property of the government, without obeying the rules of the franchise. And number 3, third, that whenever the public needs require, the public may take it upon the payment of due compensation. And that would be the 5th Amendment, takings clause, eminent domain. If they want to take your property without your consent, they have to reimburse you for it, and they have to give you the fair market value. Okay? So those are the rules, and we're going to tabulate those and discuss them at length here to make sure you completely understand them. So let's go to the next page. So here's a summary of those rules. Okay, there's 5 instances here. We broke them all down. Okay, and we have a column over here for whether consent is required. So we identify when they have to get your consent and when they don't, under all the 5 instances that the court mentioned. Okay, there are 3 items in the court's list, but we broke them down. Okay, the number 1, the owner of the property justly enjoys full and exclusive use and control of the property. This right includes the right to exclude government uses or ownership of said property, and requires consent of the owner, and the answer is yes. Okay, so in that condition, you would be the absolute owner of the property. Okay, and there's only two types of ownership: absolute and qualified. Okay, absolute means you have total, complete, exclusive use and control over the property, and qualified means you share it with somebody else. Okay, Number 2, he may not use the property to injure the equal rights of his neighbor. For instance, when you murder someone, the government can take your liberty and labor from you by putting you in jail, or your life from you by instituting the death penalty against you. Both your life and your labor are property. Therefore, the basis for the taking was violation of the equal rights of a fellow sovereign neighbor. Okay? And do they require your consent in that case? And the answer is no. If you murdered somebody, you're going to jail, whether you consent or not, and you could be electrocuted or executed. And there's, lots of people do it, or lots of governments do it, and it's perfectly just. As a matter of fact, it's perfectly biblical too, because the Ten Commandments say that, if you kill a man, then you got to be put to death. Okay? Thou shalt not kill. And if you look at the Mosaic laws, you'll see that the penalty for killing is to be killed. Number 3, he cannot be compelled or required to use it to benefit his neighbor. That means he cannot be compelled to donate the property to any franchise that would benefit his neighbor, such as Social Security, Medicare, income tax, etc. Okay? And so we go over to this column, requires consent, and the answer is yes. So in other words, they can't force you to donate your property to a public use or to provide a benefit to the public or anything, because if you're the absolute owner, then you have the right to exclude all others, meaning you have the right to exclude even the government from benefiting or using or taxing the property, because you're the absolute owner, not the qualified owner. Number 4, if he donates it to a public use, he gives the public the right to control that use, and that required your consent too, because it was a donation, and all donations must be voluntary or they're thefts. And number 5, whenever the public needs require, the public may take it without his consent upon payment of due compensation, e.g. eminent domain. So if they take your house because they want to build a freeway, they got to pay you the fair market value before they doze it. And that did not require your consent, but it did require an equal exchange of money. Note, there is only one condition, which is number 2 in this table, in which the conversion of private property to public property does not require compensation or consent, which is when the owner injures someone with it and the taking happens after the injury. Okay, so there's only one condition when they can take it without your consent, without paying you for it, which is when you hurt somebody with it, and that source of authority to take your property is called the criminal law. Okay, so under the criminal law, for instance, if they catch you growing marijuana or drugs of any kind, and those drugs are hurting other people, then they find out that you're selling these drugs or growing these drugs, they'll come in and raid your house and they'll take all your weed or all your meth lab components and walk off with them. Why? Because you're using that property to hurt other people, and they'll confiscate them. And in some cases, they not only will confiscate the paraphernalia, they'll confiscate the house it was in, because that's called drug forfeiture laws. So, but once again, a crime, the predicate is that a crime has to be committed before those types of confiscations or thefts can occur. So, moving on, taxpayer require your consent, Form 5.002 on our forms page. And, answer number 2, only by volunteering to assume the status of a franchisee, e.g. taxpayer, citizen, spouse, driver, etc., absent duress or coercion of any kind, can the government regulate the use of exclusively private property. In this way, you donate your private property to a public use, public purpose, and a public office. And if there was any duress applied to force you to volunteer, then the regulation becomes a form of theft. For instance, if you go in and apply for one franchise, lots of times they try to hook you into every other franchise in the world. If you go into the DMV and they'll say, well, you got to have a Social Security number, or you got to have a taxpayer identification number, and we won't issue a license without it. Now, you could approach that, and once they do that, now you're associating your formerly private activities to a public office, because you can't use that number without being a public officer. You can't use public property, meaning the number and the license. It's a de facto license to represent a public office. You cannot use that number in association with your private activities. So the activities instantly become public. So in other words, they are basically accepting your employment application as if you go in and apply for a driver's license, and you're a full-time employee, whether you want to be or not. How's that for theft? On the other hand, if you've been studying our materials, you know that it's illegal to use or apply for a Social Security number or a taxpayer identification number as a private person, and you also know that you don't want a license anyway. Now, do you? So if you're forced to go in there because they said you had to apply for one because they gave you a ticket for not having one, and you go in there and apply for one, and you tell them, I don't have a number, I don't consent to use a number, and it's a crime to use a number, and you have just told me that I can't get a license without it, so would you please sign this certificate of disqualification indicating that I came in to ask for a license and you said you couldn't give me one. I didn't really want one anyway. All I wanted to be was disqualified. And I just want to have legal evidence to show to the officer that I'm not qualified to either have or use a license, because I'm not a public officer and I don't consent to be one, and I can't elect myself into an office by applying for or using a number, a Social Security number. That's a crime. Violation of the rules for converting private property to public property. A theft of property has occurred on behalf of the government if it attempts to do any of the following: circumvents any of the above rules that we just discussed, any of those 5 rules, tries to blur, confuse, or obfuscate the distinction between private property and public property, refuses to identify exactly which of the 5 mechanisms identified in the preceding table was employed in each specific case where it asserts a right to regulate the use of private property, or asserts a right to convert the character of the property from private to public, or asserts a right to tax what you thought was private property. So they have to show you which of those 5 rules they're using. And we'll give you a hint. The only one they can pick, if you don't consent, is the one that requires them to pay you. Now, wouldn't you like to be paid every time they want to enforce? I would. Is your ignorance of the law and the rules for converting property causing you to unknowingly donate property to the government and make it public property? Or to condone and further government theft? The only difference between theft and a donation is consent. Do you know they need your consent? Because if you do, now they're thieves, if you can prove that requirement. And is your ignorance of the law aiding and abetting conspiracies by public servants to deceive you about what the law permits or requires and deprive you of constitutional rights? You might want to think about that. And here is a table comparing public versus private franchises, meaning government franchises are here and private franchises are here. The only difference between the two, the main difference, is the prerequisite that you must have a domicile on the territory of the government grantor before they can involve you in their franchise. And if they don't, they're acting extraterritorially and they're acting as private parties. Franchise agreement is civil law for the government, is civil law associated with the domicile of those who are statutory but not constitutional citizens and residents within the venue of the grantor, the government grantor. Whereas under private law, it's among all those who expressly consented in writing. The consent to the franchise is procured by, and then for the government, it's implied by action of the participants, using the government's license number or declaring a status under the franchise. That's how you consented. And for private franchises, it's expressed by signing a written contract absent duress. Franchise rights are the property of, under the government franchises, it's the property of the government. If the property is outside of de facto government, if the property is outside of the federal territory, and the human being or private company in the case of private franchises. The choice of law governing disputes under the franchise agreement is the franchise agreement itself, and in Federal Rule 17b, under the government franchises, and the franchise agreement only under private franchises. Disputes are legally resolved in what kind of court? For government franchises, it's in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, statutory franchise court with inequity, meaning like, tax court, traffic court, and so on. Whereas for private franchises, it would be a constitutional court in equity. So you're always equal when you sue a private company, And the only inequality that can be enforced is that which is documented in the franchise, whereas the private franchise contract. Whereas in a government franchise, an executive branch arbitration board, essentially, pretending to be a court, like tax court or family court or traffic court, instead will hear the matter. And the guy who's hearing it is not a judge. He's just an administrator. They call them commissioners. They don't call them judges. I mean, you may call them a judge if you're an idiot, but they're not really judges. And courts officiating disputes operate in political context and issue political opinions for government franchises. Because why? Because the executive branch is a political branch, and all franchise courts are in the political branch, the executive branch in this case. Whereas under a private contract, officiated disputes are officiated in a legal context, and they issue orders instead, because it's a constitutional court. Disputes are typically heard in a constitutional court unless the franchise itself calls for private arbitration. The parties to the contract are public officers within the government grantor of the franchise in the case of government franchises on the left here. Whereas under private franchises, they maintain their status as private parties and not public officers. So you don't have to be a person or a citizen or a resident to litigate a private dispute under a private franchise contract. And you can do it under the common law in a common law court, but you can't do it for a government franchise. It's always in a franchise court. And finally, domicile of the franchise participants. For government franchises, it's always federal territory, and see these authorities. 26 U.S.C. 7701A39 and 7408D. Those two provisions of the Internal Revenue Code govern choice of law for the Internal Revenue franchise, the income tax franchise, which is a public officer franchise. And for private franchise, the domicile of the franchise participants is wherever the parties declare it or express it in the franchise itself. The federal war on private rights. Since the founding of this country, a concerted effort has been underway by corrupted politicians to undermine the protection of private rights, to unlawfully convert private rights into public rights, and to turn a de jure government into a de facto government, and thus a private, for-profit federal corporation in which all citizens and states are really just statutory employees or officers of the corporation. The following pages will break down each of the above three elements into their component parts. For more information, please see How Scoundrels Corrupted Our Republican Form of Government on the Family Guardian sister site. So the first one we had was how corrupted governments undermine the protection of private rights. They refused to hear litigation that would address the dividing line between the public and the private. In other words, they don't want to talk about how the conversion occurred because they know they're stealing and they want to protect their right to steal. So they're going to protect all the people that are doing the stealing by not talking about the fact that they're violating the law. That's called obstruction of justice. Judges do it all the time, especially in franchise courts. Number two, omitting to address or making unpublished issues raised in litigation that would address the dividing line between the public and the private rights. So in other words, they're going to censor any evidence that enters the record. They'll try to interfere with your efforts to introduce evidence proving that they stole from you, that you never consented to convert it from private to public. They'll strike pleadings from the record. They'll strike evidence. They'll grant motions in limine by the government to suppress the evidence. They may even seal the record so nobody can read it because they know they're thieves and liars and crooks and counterfeiters and baby killers and the whole bit. Drug pushers and so on. They'll refuse to issue a government ID to those who refuse to associate themselves with franchise statuses, domicile on federal territory, or government identifying numbers. And we show this in Why Domicile and Becoming a Taxpayer Require Your Consent, Form 05.002, Section 14.4. Okay, we prove that the government basically turns government ID, like driver's licenses or state ID or resident ID cards or passports, they try to turn those IDs into a method of converting your status, essentially identity theft. They use IDs as a means of identity theft to make you into a public officer whether you know it or not, and oftentimes without your consent. It's very important to attach something to those applications to make sure that your identity isn't laundered so you become an involuntary public officer in the de facto government. They may also refuse to recognize or protect private rights, thus compelling people to pursue a franchise status to have any remedy at all. In other words, they'll say, well, we're not going to hear any disputes under the common law, and the only thing we're going to let you talk about is what's in the statutes, even though we know you're not subject to them. And that way, by availing yourself of the privileges or benefits, you're basically consenting to become a public officer. So in other words, you're screwed unless you volunteer to work for me for free, full time, 24/7, and take and donate whatever we want out of the revenues that arise from those activities, because we own you. They may also refuse to provide forms or procedures for use by other persons other than franchisees. For instance, they may on their tax withholding forms, but they may deny you the ability to have a status other than a public officer. Like on the W-8 form, Block 3, the only block they have for anything like a person is an individual. Well, human beings are not individuals unless they're public officers. So you have to add your own box in there. And if you add your own box, sometimes they'll interfere with making that form accurate by adding that box. In other words, they'll compel you to commit perjury because the form is signed under penalty of perjury. They may also refuse to provide remedies or assistance to persons other than franchisees. This is a violation of the requirement for equal protection of the laws. And they may ignore responsive correspondence to all tax collection notices, thus forcing the target of illegal tax enforcement to become the target for criminal levies and liens and the violation of rights they represent. They may also cause those who insist that they are private parties not acting as public officers or franchisees to be called frivolous. They may call you frivolous because you say you're not a taxpayer or a driver or a spouse under the family code. Or to be subject to an unconstitutional bill of attainder through administrative penalties. Remember, they can only penalize people who are franchisees. If you're not a franchisee, then they're essentially exercising eminent domain, which is a conversion of private property to public property without the consent of the owner, without compensation. Or they may compel you to be identified as a domestic terrorist. They may say you're a terrorist because you, God forbid, you want to be equal to them. Even though the Constitution requires equal protection, equal treatment, even though the foundation of the government and the Constitution is equality and equal treatment, they may call you a terrorist or a psycho because you insist on being equal. Figure that one out. Or they may try to subject you to psychological evaluation for being crazy, a wacko, because you expect them to do their job, the only job they were created to do, which is protect private rights by preventing them from being converted to public rights. Hello? And corrupting constitutional courts. They may try to corrupt the constitutional courts by replacing Article 3 constitutional courts with Article 4 legislative franchise courts. We talk about that in What Happened to Justice, Form 6.012. They may try to force those who administer constitutional courts to have a criminal financial conflict of interest by, for instance, making judges statutory taxpayers. This started in 1938 with O'Malley versus Woodrow, 301 U.S. 277. See also United States versus Hatter, Lucas versus Earl. So in other words, Congress starting in 1938 made judges taxpayers. And do you think any judge that's beholden to IRS extortion can ever execute a fair, just ruling and be objective if he knows he could be destroyed because the IRS doesn't like his ruling? Hello? That's called a criminal conflict of interest. And it's documented in 18 U.S.C. 208. Every judge that hears a tax matter who's a taxpayer is a criminal. And that's why he shouldn't be allowed to decide. The jury is the only one that can decide, and even those people on the jury cannot be taxpayers, or they have a financial conflict of interest. And especially if the U.S. attorney gets up in front of the jury and says, this man is a leech. He won't pay his fair share, and all of you are going to have to pick up his bill. What do you think about that? And by the way, they do it all the time. And that's a crime. When they do that tactic, the courtroom becomes the scene of a crime, and the criminal is the U.S. attorney if he pulls that card. They may also force lawyers to obtain a license to practice, which confers a conflict of interest that undermines the rights of their clients, because the minute they have a license is the minute they become public officers, and now they're serving two masters. They're serving the state and they're serving their client. And we'll give you a hint. The state always comes first. So they're serving God and Mammon, where Mammon means the government, and they always have a conflict of interest, and they will always defer to the judge and the court and the government at the expense of their client. And that's why it's probably not a good idea to ever hire a lawyer if you can avoid it. And we talk about this in Unlicensed Practices of Law, Form 5.029. They may also, in order to corrupt and undermine the protection of private rights, they may also unlawfully enforce federal franchises within states of the Union. They're not allowed to do it. The U.S. Supreme Court said so in the license tax cases. They said Congress cannot create a trade or business in a state in order to tax it. Well, what is the tax on that the IRS enforces now? We'll give you a hint. It's called a trade or business. Hello? The tax is on the very thing that the Supreme Court said in the license tax cases that they couldn't create in a state. And that's why the definitions, even to this day in the Internal Revenue Code in Section 7700, in a geographical sense, do not include any state of the Union, and because they can't. And the only way they have around that little game, that slight little problem, that definition problem, is to play with the word includes. And when they do that, they're violating due process and stealing by presumption. We talk about that in the meaning of includes and including in one of our other pamphlets. They may also allow people receiving government benefits and who therefore have a criminal conflict of interest to vote or serve on jury duty. This causes jurists to rule in favor of the government in any litigation affecting their benefits, thus making them into public officer recruiters. It's like we said earlier, if the U.S. attorney is in front of the jury and he says, this man is a moocher, he's receiving the benefits, quote unquote, of being here, and yet he refused to pay his, quote, fair share. And that, ladies and gentlemen on the jury, is why all of you are going to have to pay what he doesn't want to pay. Now, what do you think about that? Hang him. And by the way, that's not new. I mean, that's what the Pharisees did to Jesus. They accused him of being a taxpayer too. So some things never change, do they? Now, on this subject, the Bible says, the king establishes the land by justice, but he who receives bribes, that is, government benefits, overthrows it. So technically, they aren't allowed to, the judge or the juries are not allowed to be taxpayers if they're hearing a case on taxpayers. Likewise, they're not allowed to be drivers if they're hearing a case on the vehicle code and it's a real court instead of a traffic court. Or they may deliberately try omitting to prosecute those engaging in any of the above, even upon receipt of a valid criminal complaint. So in other words, if you tell them about all these methods of corrupting the court system and you try to prevent them, then they may omit deliberately to benefit the government the prosecution of those crimes. Based on our previous discussion of how governments undermine the protection of private rights, let us give you a startling example of exactly how this works. We're going to show you a short video clip from an interview with Peter Schiff, who is the son of Irwin Schiff. Irwin Schiff is perhaps the most famous tax honesty advocate in American history, and he was railroaded, maliciously prosecuted, and slandered by the government. And you'll have a chance to hear how he was treated in court to prove our assertions.
I'd like to talk about with you is the income tax. This is interesting. I've met your father, and he's a highly principled guy, but he let them put him in jail for years because of.
Well, he's still there.
I know.
He's 80. He's 85 or 86. I forget now.
This is
exactly
shocking that they would put a guy that age in jail, not for any crime of any type, but just for standing up? What do you think about this? Tell me about Irwin and what this is all about.
Well, I regard my father as a political prisoner. I mean, that's right. You know, governments put people in prison if they represent a threat to the government. And I think the government perceives my father as a threat. In fact, I think he's categorized as a terrorist. But he's not terrorizing Americans. I think, you know, maybe he could strike fear into the government if they think that, hey, you know, if Schiff's ideas catch on, we're in trouble. But, you know, my father believes in liberty and the Constitution and the rule of law, and he doesn't believe that the government collects taxes legally. He thinks the government violates not only the codified law, not only the Internal Revenue Code, but the Constitution, and he has several Supreme Court decisions that back him up. And so he was, you know, he challenged it, not because he wanted to, you know, enrich himself and just, you know, not pay taxes. I mean, he's very upfront. It's not like he was deceiving the government and hiding his income, or, you know, I don't pay taxes, and here's why, and here's, you know, my rationale. And so the worst thing you could say about my father is that he was mistaken. You can't say that he was dishonest in what he believed. I think a lot of what he says is true, but the problem is the courts let the government get away with murder today. And look, the court said, and it was a 5-4 decision, but the Supreme Court said Obamacare is constitutional. Now what, there were 4 justices that said it was unconstitutional. Are those 4 justices wrong? Why were the other 5 right? You know, I thought it was unconstitutional. I still think it's unconstitutional. I don't care, you know, what, you know, these judges that were pressured by politics, because one of the guys, changed his mind like at the last second just because of political pressure. So, you know, I think that, you know, my father's, a lot of what he says is true about the income tax. But certainly, even if you don't look at the legal aspects of it, you can look at the economic aspects of it, and it's been a very destructive tax. It continues to be a destructive tax. It's probably the most destructive tax that we have. We'd be much better off as a nation if we abolished it.
But it is. But you know, the point that you made is an excellent one, Peter. He actually is a political prisoner because he stood up against the principle of the income tax, and they put him in jail for a decade.
Yeah, and if you read the trial transcript, so we have an appeal going right now, but it's taking forever just to get the appeals. But the judge, basically in this case, was, you know, I believe he was instructed to orchestrate a conviction. They stacked the jury. They put a bunch of Social Security and welfare recipients on the jury, and they basically say, if you acquit this guy, you're not going to get your Social Security checks anymore because nobody will pay income taxes. They don't let my father put on a case. They wouldn't let him introduce any evidence. They wouldn't let him put witnesses on. They wouldn't let him, every time he wanted to do something, no, you can't call that witness, you can't call this, you can't do this. So he really wasn't able to defend himself. He didn't have a lawyer at the time, but, you know, and he could barely hear, you know, because he didn't have his hearing aid. And so part of it, he got like a year for contempt because, you know, in addition to his like 12-year or 13-year sentence. But, you know, the government doesn't really even prove their case. They put in no evidence. In fact, you know, when my father puts, you know, there's a, you know, IRS agent on the stand, and my father would say, okay, here's my tax return that you said is false. What, you know, what's false about it? And the government would object, and the judge would, and so my father couldn't even ask the agents. Nobody testified what was false about my father's returns. All they said is he had income and he didn't pay his taxes, therefore he's guilty. You know, they wouldn't let him examine anybody. They wouldn't let him. There were people that, you know, lawyers or judges or people that, you know, believed him. He couldn't call them as witnesses. No. I mean, the whole thing. If you ever hear of this, you know, a banana court or kangaroo court you know, star chamber. That's what it really was. It was just an orchestrated conviction. It was the pretense of a fair trial. And then meanwhile, he gets 13 years in jail. You know, it's a nonviolent crime. It's that, you know,
no, it's completely shocking. It's all a political show trial. I mean, it would be embarrassing to the Stalinists. It's shocking.
Yeah, and even, you know, the government hired a psychiatrist to examine my dad, and basically the psychiatrist said that my father was so rigid in his beliefs that he was like, that no matter, he was going to believe what he believed no matter what. Like my father was very sincere in his beliefs. The government hired the psychiatrist, and then my father wanted to call the psychiatrist to testify, and they wouldn't let him. And they wouldn't let him introduce any of his findings, because the psychiatrist would have been a good witness for my father, because he would have showed that my father believed what he said. According to the psychiatrist, my father was very genuine in his beliefs. The psychiatrist the government hired.
Yeah.
And then my father wants to call him as a witness, and they won't let him.
Well, they don't want to talk about philosophical principles and actual beliefs. Now, one more question, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, unfortunately. So
one more thing I want to tell you about my father, too. This is interesting. Because so they said that my father committed fraud, and he told people how not to pay taxes. So my father wanted to introduce as evidence his books, his videotape seminars, and they wouldn't let him. So he's trying. They say, "Here's what you did that was fraudulent. Okay, let's show the jury the things that I said." Oh no, they can't see that. They can't. So the government. Normally, you would think that the government would want to put that in as evidence to show, look at the things that Irwin Schiff did. My father wanted to get all that stuff in, and the government objected, and the court didn't let it in.
Peter, it's impossible to have any respect for the whole system at this point.
If you go to his website, paynoincometax.com, I think you can actually read. There's a lot of stuff from his trial transcript. You can read a lot of this stuff. It's up on the internet.
Number 2, how corrupted governments unlawfully convert private rights to public rights. Okay, so we just showed you how they undermine the protection of private rights. Now we're going to show you how they unlawfully perform the conversion in violation of those 5 rules that we talked about earlier. They may deliberately try to confuse context for geographical words of art between the constitutional and statutory context. And we talk about that in meaning of word includes and including in Form 5.014. That's a very prevalent tactic. You need to be very familiar with it. They may also try to abuse words of arts, such as includes and including, to unlawfully enlarge the statutory definitions of terms to include essentially private property, even though it can't. And we talk about that in the same pamphlet, meaning of the words includes and including, Form 5.014. And they may try to abuse presumption. They may assume that you're a taxpayer or a driver or a spouse. They may refuse to meet the burden of proof of proving that you consented to acquire those statuses or that you could lawfully consent. Most of the time you can't even lawfully consent, even if you want those statuses. They may try to encourage private companies to illegally compel the use of government identifying numbers for commercial transactions of private people. This is a conspiracy against rights, and we have a form for that. Why it is illegal for me to request or use a taxpayer identification number, Form 04.206. You can apply that to any case where they demand a Social Security number when one is not required. A crime is being committed in that case. And the idiots that are insisting on these numbers are basically relying on essentially propaganda from some government worker who probably isn't even using their real name and probably can't produce a statute that mandates the use of the number. And even if they could produce a statute, the statute probably doesn't pertain to you anyway because you're not a quote person or a franchisee or a contractor of the government. They may also encourage the filing of knowingly false and fraudulent information returns, W-2, 1099, 1098, 1042S, and so on. That is probably the most prevalent of all method for converting private property to public property, unlawfully and without the consent of the owner, I might add. Because those information returns can only be filed in connection with a, quote, trade or business, unquote. And trade or business is then defined as the functions of a public office. So if you're not lawfully engaged in a public office and you're not a citizen, resident, taxpayer, inhabitant, and so on, and you're a non-resident, then you can't acquire any of those statuses. You can't even be an individual, especially if you don't want to do business with anybody in the government. Then you can't be an individual. And it's a crime to impersonate a public officer, so it's a crime to be an individual. And therefore they can't file those information returns. And those information returns essentially are being used as what we call election devices. They're electing you into public office without even your knowledge in many cases. And that's a crime. And the resulting revenue flows that occurs because of that crime furthers another crime, that is, bribe to procure a public office. You're bribing the government to treat you as a public officer now if you have any withholdings documented on that information return. And we talk about all those crimes in Correcting Erroneous Information Returns, Form 04.001 on our website in the Forms page. They may unlawfully enforce the Internal Revenue Code to steal from people and force them to become taxpayers in order to have any chance of getting their stolen money back. So they file the false information returns, and they do the withholding illegally usually, and then they make you lie about your status to get a refund. If you send in a form that wasn't a tax return, because you can't file a tax return as a non-taxpayer, all IRS forms are only for taxpayers, and if you're not a franchisee, if you send in a non-statutory private claim on your own letterhead or your own form, and you send that in, that's the only way you can do that you can ask for a return of funds unlawfully paid without becoming a taxpayer or acting like a taxpayer and thereby committing the crime of impersonating a public officer. They may interfere with that even sometimes, because they want to pretend like everybody's a public officer, and they don't want you getting out of your little cage. Your little legal franchise cage is what we call it. And they may abuse the Federal Reserve counterfeiting franchise to bribe states to give up their sovereignty and become federal corporations and franchises. See the money scam, Form 5.041. And finally, how de jure governments are transformed into de facto governments. And the most prevalent method is to make statutory citizenship into a franchise status. And we talk about that in our Why You Are a National, State National, and Constitutional but Not Statutory Citizen, Form 5.006, Section 4. And they also become a de facto government by deliberately confusing the federal government with the national government or making them synonymous. They are not. Okay? The national government has exclusive jurisdiction over federal territory. The federal government has subject matter jurisdiction within a state over a very finite number of things. Counterfeiting, slavery, and commerce are the main things they have jurisdiction over in a state. Everything else they don't have any jurisdiction over. They may also deliberately confuse constitutional citizens with statutory citizens or make them synonymous, even though they are not. For instance, they'll pretend like a citizen of the United States in the 14th Amendment is the same thing as the statutory citizen found in 8 U.S.C. 1401. They're not. Matter of fact, they're mutually exclusive. You cannot be a statutory citizen without a domicile on federal territory, period. And we proved that earlier in that form up there, Why You're a National, State National, and Constitutional but Not Statutory Citizen. And they may confuse domicile with nationality or make them synonymous, even though they are not. You cannot have any status under the civil law without a domicile in the exclusive jurisdiction of the granting government, whereas you can be a national without a domicile on the territory of that government. And if you are a national, meaning a constitutional citizen under the 14th Amendment, then you would be a statutory alien. So you can be an alien, a statutory alien, and a constitutional citizen at the same time. That's what most Americans are in states of the Union, if they were born there or are domiciled there. Other ways of transforming de jure governments into de facto governments. Making statutory citizenship mandatory for those serving on jury duty or registering to vote. For instance, if you get a jury summons, they're going to ask if you're a U.S. citizen, but they won't define which one they mean. They won't define whether it's a political citizen or a statutory citizen. And by political, we mean constitutional citizen. And if you go up there and you ask them, they're going to mumble and say, "Oh, you're one of those, freedom wackos." Really the only wacko is the jury foreman, the jury commissioner, who doesn't understand the distinction and who doesn't even want to listen to the distinction, because he'd have to admit he's a criminal because he's recruiting public officers without their knowledge. He's laundering their identities. He's engaging in massive identity theft if he converts them into statutory citizens. And another way that they convert de jure governments into de facto governments is to break down the separation of powers between the states and the national government. And we show how that's done in Government Conspiracy to Destroy the Separation of Powers, Form 5.023 on our Forms page. And for further details, we show all the methods for becoming de facto governments in De Facto Government Scam Form 5.043 on our website, forms page. Summary and conclusions. If you want to be free and protect your sovereignty, then you have to retain a private status and private property. You cannot pursue any privilege, public status, public benefit, or public right in the context of your interactions with any government, and you cannot associate public property, such as government identifying numbers, with your private property without converting that property to public property and committing a fraud. Private property and private rights are, in respect to civil statutory law, foreign, non-resident, defensible only in the common law and equity and not statutory law. If you'd like to learn more about the subjects in this pamphlet, feel free to read the following memorandums and documents on our website. Enumeration of Unalienable Rights, Form 10.002, which talks about all your rights, both natural and statutory. And Know Your Rights and Citizenship Status, Form 10.009. That talks about the distinctions between statutory citizens and constitutional citizens and the two contexts, statutory and constitutional, and how to make sure you don't confuse the two, and more importantly, to make sure that the judge and the government prosecutor don't confuse the two. And finally, Government Instituted Slavery Using Franchises, Form 05.030. This is a very important form that talks about every aspect of how franchises are created and enforced, and illegally enforced in many cases, by the de facto government. This concludes our presentation. We hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.